Hello and welcome to the Parashah in Hebrew at the Beth Emmanuel Virtual Kollel. I'm Aaron, and today we are starting with the very beginning of the Bible, the very first verse in the Torah, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So this is going to be an exciting time, and there's so much depth in these first verses of creation. I'm sure we'll not get very far. So in case you're watching this for the first time, what I do in this series is I just open up the text. It's not really rehearsed. Just open up the text and start reading through it, and then parse it out. Just explain the grammar and the vocabulary of each word in the text. And we usually get through one, maybe two verses, and I try to keep it to about 15 minutes or less. Just to make these useful bite-sized pieces. And so let's get into the text. What I'm using right now is a website called Sparia, and it's a very nice website with biblical texts and other Jewish study sources. So I'll just share my screen with you so that we can read together. And the link to this particular chapter verse is in the description of this video on the Beth Emmanuel website at bethemmanuel.org/kollel. So here we go. We'll share this screen, and so you can see. I'm now looking here at the Sefaria website. Bereshit is how you say the name of the book of Genesis in Hebrew. Chapter Aleph. Aleph is it represents the number 1, and verse Aleph. So here we go. I'll read this text slowly, and then we'll break it down. First word. Bereshit bara Elohim et ha-shamayim ve'et ha'aretz. All right. So how do we usually translate? First, here's this word, Bereshit. Most Bibles, you will find, translate this word as in the beginning. It's just one word in Hebrew, but it has a prefix in it. And the prefix is this letter bet. And that's the way Hebrew works often. You'll have a root word, and then you'll have prefixes, which generally are only one letter. And then sometimes you'll have some suffixes as well. So you might recognize these three letters together: Resh, Aleph, Shin. That's the root of the word Rosh, or head. So head can mean beginning, it can be chief or whatever. But when you add this suffix onto the end, Reshit, it means first, the beginning. And it's often the first, it's one of the words used for the first fruits, the beginning of the harvest that you bring as an offering to God. And so this word by itself just means beginning. And so this prefix, be, here, the beginning here, means in or with. It. Here's the problem. Our English translations, you don't want to have this mindset where a Hebrew word and an English word always have one-to-one relationships where you can, as if you can look at them in a chart or something like that and say, oh, be means in, or be means with, or the. It doesn't work that way. You really have to understand the whole verse in context in order to really get it. So we'll have to do that in this case too. But here's a problem now with this translation, Bereshit, meaning in the beginning. Okay, Bereshit can mean beginning, but it doesn't say in the here. It just says in, and so the is missing. Otherwise, it would be ba. Ba would be how you say in the. So there's two possibilities, that somehow we should be looking for the later in this verse somewhere, or it really isn't there. So what could this mean? Okay, I'll tell you a really important interpretation by one of the most famous rabbis, and his name is Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchak, and he lived about 1,000 years ago. He points out this problem, and he says, if it wanted to say in the beginning, like we're talking about the order in which the creation occurred, it would have said Barishonah. But Bereshit, that word, whenever it occurs, it's in what's called a noun construct state. That means you have one noun connected to another noun, and so it's like a bookshelf. It's like a shelf of books. You have two nouns together, one describing the other. And so when that happens in Hebrew, the first word usually ends up changing a little bit, and the words go in the order that you'd say something of something. So it'd be shelf of books. You could put the two nouns together, and then they work that way. And so Rashi points out that the word Bereshit usually means in the beginning of. In all the other places in Scripture where that occurs, it means in the beginning of. And so he suggests that it's not in the beginning God created. It's something more like in the beginning of God's act of creating. Okay, well, the nice thing is we don't have to just accept Rashi's interpretation. We can argue with it. We can agree. We can disagree. It is very important that we respect it, though, and take it seriously. My big problem with Rashi's explanation, number one, is that there isn't a noun that comes after that. And Rashi attempts to provide examples where you have a noun construct that's connected to something other than a noun, but I don't find it terribly convincing. This word here, bara, means he created, God, and it's referring to, this is the subject, God. So Elohim, God, bara, created. So you wouldn't have a noun construct from a noun to a verb. It just doesn't work that way. It's not normal Hebrew, and there is no grammatical reason, just based on the way this word is formed, that it should have to be considered a construct. Because even though maybe Bereshit often shows up as a noun construct, this word Reshit by itself here, without the prefix, isn't always a noun construct. It's a noun of its own right. It's a normal noun. So I don't think it's necessary to see it that way. But still, in the beginning doesn't seem like it makes sense. I think Rashi's correct that saying, if you wanted to say in the beginning, it would be Barishonah, not Bereshit. So then what could this mean? I'm just going to throw out my interpretation. I think that you know how in English we have a suffix, an ly suffix. So we'll say quickly, for example. What that does is it changes words into an adverb. Well, bait can do that as well. It can change words into an adverb. It works a lot like the ly in English. So adverbs can be used to describe verbs. So we're describing God's creation with an adverb. And I think then if Reshit is the first or the beginning, I think Bereshit means something more like firstly or at first. And so I would disagree with Rashi in that I do think that this is, in some sense, describing the timing in which God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I don't necessarily think that we're saying in the beginning of all time, and that's the way that people usually interpret it, in the beginning of all things. I think that it doesn't say what it's in the beginning of, but it does appear to be setting things in order. Now, I'm not saying that first God creates the heavens and the earth, and then God creates the other things in subsequent verses. I'm thinking, and this is what Rashi argues. He says, look, the heavens aren't created until further on in the verse or in the chapter. So how can it be saying this right up at the front that it happens in the beginning? Okay, fair enough. But I think we can still see it as an introduction, like a title, like a summary. And then it goes in and says God creates the heavens and the earth, and then it goes on to describe in more detail. So let's continue on so that you can see how the rest of this verse is shaping up. So we have Bereshit. So in or with or at Reshit, beginning, in the beginning, or first. Bara, he created. Now this is a very simple verb. The way that verbs work in Hebrew, there's different tenses, of course, just like in English, and there's different binyanim, which are sort of it's a framework that verbs can take on these different forms depending on whether they're like active or passive or very intense or reflexive or whatever. But the very simplest form is what we're seeing right here. You just have two ah sounds, and that just is the masculine, singular, and third person form. So he created. And then the subject here is God, Elohim, and that comes after the verb generally in Hebrew. So in English, we'll usually say the man created or the man built. Or we would say God created and put it in that order where the person doing the action comes first. In Hebrew, you don't have to do that. You can start with the verb. And there's a different way of showing who does what, and I'll get to that in just a second here. So it's God created. And then this next word, et, right here, is not translated using a word in English, but it is translated. It's translated using word order in English. What we communicate with our order of words in English, Hebrew communicates using this word right here. It's a marker. It indicates what is the object of the sentence. So if you have a sentence like, the dog bit the boy, the dog was the one doing the biting, so he's the subject. The boy was the one being bit, so that's the object. Et tells you what the object is. So here we have ha-shamayim. Ha-shamayim means heaven. Shamayim is generally the word for heaven, but then ha is the. And so we know that that's the object of this sentence. So God created heaven. In English, we just don't tend to say the heaven. It sounds archaic, and if we ever do, it's because of just the uniqueness of Hebrew that we've imported into English. And then v'et, so this is the same word as the original et, except it's got a v, and v means and, right? So we'll translate that part using the word and then this part, again, we're just translating using word order. It's just telling us that this next word, haaretz, is another one of the things that God created. So haaretz means the land or the earth. The root form of it is eretz. You can see it up here. Eretz means land or earth. And the ha is a prefix that means the. So the land or the earth. So first, God created heaven and earth, or the heavens and the earth, as we will often say. So that's the basics of it. Any other things to want to get into on this? I'm not so sure. There's so much that could be said, but I don't want to bog it down with too many details. Shamayim looks like it's plural, which is interesting. You have it looks like it's actually in a form that's two plural, a double, or like a dual plural. Like in Hebrew, you have two ways of making something plural. You can say im, and then it makes it sound like it's plural often. And then you have this ayim ending where it makes it sound like there's two of them. So, but shamayim is an example of something that's always in that form. It's never something else. It's never just sham, or shami or something like that. And so, but it's singular nonetheless. And so that's that. And I think we'll just move on to the next verse in next time around. Maybe that will be on Friday morning. We'll see about that. And thanks for watching. We'll talk to you then.